What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today I am bringing you 4 bold predictions ahead of Week 7 of the NFL season. Now, keep in mind, these are bold predictions, things that are unlikely to happen, but also aren't impossible. If they hit, awesome, but if they don't, it was expected that they weren't going to. These are all within the realm of possibility, though. But before we dive on into that list, if you are juggling multiple fantasy football teams and feeling overwhelmed, FantasyPros will help you simplify things. With My Playbook's multi-league assistant, you can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all of your teams. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory clearer and easier. Dive in, let us help you dominate all your leagues with the multi-league assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the My Playbook app. Alrighty, y'all, let's dive on into these bold predictions now, starting with number 1. Mike Evans and Chris Godwin will both finish as top 7 fantasy wide receivers this week. Yes, both of them, not just one, but both of them. This Sunday night football game in Week 7 has a chance to be an explosion of offense. Over the last 4 weeks, both of these teams are top 5 in passing yards allowed, top 5 in fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers, top 7 in receiving yards allowed per game to wide receivers, and bottom 10 in rushing yards allowed to running backs. This could be a back and forth air raid between these two teams, which makes sense because the projected point total for this game opened up at 49.5 to start the week, which is the 3rd highest, only behind 2 games with 51.5. So as for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin specifically, then, we all know this. Baltimore gets chewed up by wide receivers. They've allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, the 2nd most receiving yards to wide receivers, and tied for the most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers as well. This is a pass funnel defense, as we established last week when I talked about Terry McLaurin finishing as a top 5 option. The Ravens are so good against the run. They want you to throw against them. They've allowed the 2nd fewest rushing yards to running backs. They've been run on at the 3rd lowest rate this year. They're allowing only 3 yards per rush, which is the lowest mark in the league. So this is a game where I think we see Mike Evans potentially score a couple of times. Chris Godwin rips off a few big yak plays, yards after catch plays. Like, think back to Week 5 when we saw both T. Higgins and Jamar Chase finish as top 5 options on the week. So I love Mike Evans and Chris Godwin in this game. I think they both have the upside to finish as top 7 wide receivers this week. Let's move on to bold prediction number 2, though. We're going to flip the script, get a little bit negative here. Bold prediction number 2 is that David Montgomery scores less than 7 fantasy points against the Minnesota Vikings. I absolutely love David Montgomery, all right? He has been so good this year. He is the dream fit for what the Detroit Lions want to do on offense. He's currently the running back 10 on the season. He's scored at least 15 fantasy points in every game this year. He has 3 weekly finishes inside of the top 12 running backs, and his lowest finish is only the running back 20. So he has been at least, bare minimum, a running back 2, if not a running back 1 for your team every single week. However, I think this streak of excellence could potentially come to a halt against the Minnesota Vikings. I hate the philosophy of taking away when a player does good and they become bad, which it's like a no-duh statement, but David Montgomery has scored 6 times in 5 games this year, and the Vikings have only given up 1 rushing touchdown to running backs on the entire season. So when you look at Monty's fantasy numbers when he doesn't score a touchdown, in Week 1 he would have only had 10.3 points, Week 2 11, Week 3 he still would have been fine, 15.2, but then in Week 4 only 9 fantasy points, Week 6 only 9 fantasy points he would have scored as well. This Vikings run defense, they are legit. This Viking defense overall is legit. They're giving up only 15.5 fantasy points per game to running backs this year. That is the 2nd lowest mark in the entire league. They give up only 67 yards of rushing per game, also the 2nd lowest mark in the league. And they've been run on at only 27%. They've been run on 27.7% of the time this year, which is also the lowest mark in the league. This is, again, another pass funnel defense. Teams can throw on the Minnesota Vikings, but they will not give up any yards on the ground. I love Monty. I love Ben Johnson. I love this Detroit offense, but this Vikings defense is just killer, man. And if Monty doesn't find the end zone, I think there's a really good chance he actually underwhelms in fantasy football this week. So David Montgomery scores less than 7 fantasy points against the Minnesota Vikings this week. Bold prediction number 3, let's talk a little bit more positively about a running back in the NFL. How about J.K. Dobbins, finishing as a top 3 running back this week against the Arizona Cardinals? Last week, the Cardinals, they did keep Josh Jacobs in check for only 12 fantasy points and a running back 23 finish on the week. But might I remind you what the Chargers game plan, is every single week. The Chargers want to run the ball, they want to run it again, and they're going to run it a crap ton more after that, okay? Like, J.K. Dobbins was given a season high 24 rush attempts without Gus Edwards last week, for goodness sake. Like, he is going to continue to keep getting fed. And despite holding Josh Jacobs to only 62 rushing yards and 18 attempts last week, the Cardinals still are second in rushing yards allowed to running backs and have been run on 116 times, which is tied for most in the entire league over the last 4 weeks. Teams are still electing to run on the Arizona Cardinals. They can try and sell out to stop the run all they want, just like they did against the Green Bay Packers, forced Jordan Love to beat them. But the Chargers last week, they got both Rashawn Slater back and Joe Alt. And the Chargers are much more of a run-centric team than the Green Bay Packers. That's what they know to do well, so they're going to continue doing it better than everybody else, and that's how they're going to bully you every single week. We don't care if you want to try and sell out, we're still going to beat you on the ground. That is what the Harbaugh philosophy wants to do. So I think there's a real chance we see Dobbins, scamper for potentially 120 plus yards in this game, fall into the end zone more than once as well. We've already seen Dobbins finish as the running back 4 and the running back 5 to start the year. This could be the week he launches himself into the top 3. So bold prediction number 3 is that J.K. Dobbins finishes as a top 3 running back this week versus the Arizona Cardinals. Last bold prediction now. This is honestly probably my favorite one of the week. Drake Maye finishes as a top 5 fantasy quarterback against the Jacksonville Jaguars in London this week. I love this pick for a multitude of different reasons because Drake Maye in his rookie debut did not hold back from slinging it. He was 20 of 32 for 234 and 3 TDs, threw 2 picks as well. But you know what? In his NFL debut against the Houston Texans, I don't want to say that was totally expected, but you're not surprised to see those 2 interceptions. Despite that, though, he was still the quarterback 10 on the week. If he can hang with the Houston Texans defense in that regard, frankly, I am praying for the Jacksonville Jaguars defense this week, who are just spiraling downwards right now. Over the last 4 weeks, the Jaguars defense has allowed the 3rd most passing yards. They've allowed 27.3 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. That is 4 more points per game than any other defense in the entire league. And they have given up 13 passing touchdowns. That is 3 more than any other defense. The Jaguars secondary cannot defend anybody right now. I don't care if Drake Maye is throwing to blossoming Jalen Polk, ever steady Demario Douglas, and Hunter Henry, right? This secondary is struggling. But what I really think can actually elevate Drake Maye to top 5 status this week is that he's quietly really, really good on his feet. Per Ron Stewart over on X, Drake Maye is second to only Jaden Daniels this year in scramble rate. It is a small sample of only 54 dropbacks. That's all we've gotten from Drake Maye this year. But he added 38 rushing yards last week, which quickly adds up when you're getting 1 yard for every 10 yards of rushing. That's nearly 4 extra points Drake Maye had added onto his total last week. So he has athletic ability. He can get outside of the pocket, create yards outside of the pocket by his legs as well. So not only do I think this is a great matchup for Drake Maye, but even if it is in London, his rushing upside is what makes it even sweeter, adds that extra oomph that could potentially get him past the quarterback 9, the quarterback 10, but get him all the way up to top 5. So that's what makes this a bold prediction. It's his second ever start in the league. Really, we're thinking about him as a top 5 quarterback potentially this week. Yeah, because the matchup is there and he can get it done with his legs. So that's my last bold prediction, is that Drake Maye finishes as a top 5 fantasy quarterback this week. That's all I've got for you, though. Those are my 4 bold predictions ahead of week 7. Before we sign off here, though, remember, if you're juggling a multitude of fantasy football teams and feeling overwhelmed, FantasyPros will help you simplify things. With My Playbook's multi-league assistant, you can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all of your teams. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory clearer and easier. Dive in. Let us help you dominate all your leagues with the multi-league assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the MyPlaybook app.